On the morning of December 5, 1941, at precisely 3 a.m., Soviet Siberian ski troops emerged from the forests surrounding Kalinin, 160 kilometers northwest of Moscow. The temperature had dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius. These weren't the exhausted, disorganized Red Army formations the Germans had been routing for 5 months. These soldiers wore quilted cotton jackets rated to minus 40 degrees, wide skis designed for fresh powder, and carried PPSH-41 submachine guns modified with cold-weather lubricants. They moved in complete silence across frozen ground that German sentries, huddled in commandeered peasant huts, wearing summer uniforms stuffed with newspaper, never heard them coming. By dawn, the 21st Panzer Division's forward positions had been overrun by an enemy that seemed impossibly at home in conditions that had turned the Wehrmacht into a shivering, frost-bitten shadow of itself. The paradox was stark. German military planners had counted on winter. General Franz Halder's war diaries from August 1941 explicitly note that cold weather would freeze Soviet resistance and make their primitive rail network unusable. Winter was supposed to be Germany's ally, the final blow against an already reeling enemy. Instead, it became the weapon that shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. This wasn't because Russians possessed some mystical resistance to cold. It was because whilst German commanders viewed winter as a neutral environmental factor that would affect both sides equally, perhaps even favoring their superior troops, the Soviets had spent 2 decades deliberately engineering every aspect of their military doctrine, equipment, and training around winter as an active tactical weapon. The difference wasn't genetic. It was institutional, systematic, and utterly devastating. Standard German military planning for Operation Barbarossa assumed the campaign would conclude before serious winter weather arrived. This wasn't mere overconfidence, it was backed by careful analysis. General Georg Thomas's economic staff calculated that the Soviet Union would collapse after losing the agricultural resources of Ukraine and the industrial centers of Leningrad and Moscow. The operational timeline called for victory by October 1941 at the latest. Winter clothing, therefore, received low priority in the logistics plan. When General Quartiermeister Eduard Wagner reviewed supply requirements in May 1941, winter equipment ranked below ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. The assumption was explicit. German soldiers wouldn't need heavy winter gear because they'd be garrisoning conquered territory, not fighting. Even when it became clear by September that the campaign would extend into winter, German doctrine held that their professional, well-trained forces would naturally outperform Soviet troops in harsh conditions. After all, hadn't the Wehrmacht just conquered Poland in weeks, France in 6 weeks, Yugoslavia in 11 days? German training emphasized adaptability, initiative, and resourcefulness, qualities that should, theoretically, allow soldiers to cope with any environment. The German soldier, properly motivated and led, would simply endure better than his Slavic opponent. This was stated explicitly in training manuals and officer guidance. Toughness was a command decision, not an equipment issue. This thinking pervaded even the technical branches. Panzer commanders knew that cold weather affected mechanical systems, but German engineering was considered the world's finest. The Panzer III and IV had performed brilliantly in the scorching deserts of North Africa and the spring mud of Russia. Temperature extremes were simply another engineering challenge. When issues did arise, German ingenuity would solve them. The MG-34 machine gun, the standard German squad automatic weapon, was a precision instrument with close tolerances and sophisticated recoil mechanisms. It represented the peak of firearms engineering. Surely such technical excellence would prove superior to whatever crude weapons the Soviets fielded. The reality of combat proved every assumption catastrophically wrong. What the Germans encountered wasn't improvisation or natural hardiness. It was the product of systematic development dating back to the Winter War against Finland in 1939 to 1940. That conflict, a humiliating struggle against a much smaller opponent, had taught the Red Army exactly how badly unprepared troops performed in extreme cold. Soviet casualties in that war topped 126,000 dead, many from exposure and frostbite rather than Finnish bullets. The lesson was absorbed at the highest levels. Marshal Kliment Voroshilov's post-war analysis didn't blame Finnish superiority or Soviet cowardice. It identified specific, correctable failures: inadequate cold weather clothing, weapons that froze, transport that couldn't navigate snow, and tactics designed for temperate conditions. The reforms that followed were comprehensive. The Red Army established dedicated winter warfare training centers in Siberia and the Karelian Isthmus, where temperatures routinely reached -40 degrees. Units rotated through these facilities for months-long courses. This wasn't theory. Soldiers lived in the field for weeks at a time, learning to navigate by stars when compasses froze, to identify frostbite symptoms in themselves and comrades, to dig shelters in frozen ground, to maintain weapons in conditions that turned metal into brittle, skin-tearing hazards. By 1941, every Soviet rifle division had personnel who'd completed this training. German divisions had none. The equipment development ran parallel. Soviet quartermasters studied every aspect of the Winter War failures and redesigned accordingly. The Valenki, felt boots that became iconic of Soviet winter warfare, weren't traditional Russian footwear pressed into service. They were specifically manufactured in sizes 2 sizes larger than normal boots to accommodate thick wool foot wrappings, portianki, and allow blood circulation. German boots, by contrast, were precision-fitted leather designed to look smart on parade. In -30 degrees, tight leather constricted blood flow. The result, whilst Soviet soldiers could march 40 kilometers in deep snow, German infantry were reporting frostbite casualties of 15% by December 1941 without firing a shot. The quilted Telogreika jacket and charivari trousers became standard issue for all Soviet forces by 1940. These weren't elegant. They made soldiers look bulky and shapeless, but they were engineered to specific thermal requirements. The cotton wadding provided insulation even when wet, dried quickly, and could be manufactured in vast quantities using Soviet textile capacity. Each jacket weighed 1.2 kilograms and was rated effective to -40 degrees. German soldiers in December 1941 wore the same wool uniforms they'd worn in France, supplemented by whatever they could loot or improvise. Newspaper stuffed into tunics became standard. So did wrapping feet in straw. These weren't soldiers. These were desperate men trying to survive. The standard Soviet infantry weapon by late 1941 was the PPSH-41 submachine gun. To German eyes, it looked like proof of Soviet backwardness. The receiver was stamped sheet metal. The barrel shroud was perforated steel tube. The 71-round drum magazine was held on by a simple latch. It could be manufactured by semi-skilled workers in factories without sophisticated machine tools, and was at a rate of 3,000 per day by December 1941. It weighed 3.6 kilograms, most of it in the heavy bolt and return spring. German intelligence assessments dismissed it as crude and inaccurate. What those assessments missed was that crudeness was the design philosophy, not a defect. The PPSH-41 had exactly 2 lubricant points, both accessible without tools. The bolt had generous clearances, sloppy by precision manufacturing standards, which meant snow and ice couldn't jam it. Soviet armorers issued a winter-grade lubricant that remained viscous to -50 degrees, and soldiers were trained to apply it sparingly. Too much lubricant was worse than none. It collected dirt and froze. The result was a weapon that fired reliably in conditions that turned German weapons into clubs. The German MG-34, by contrast, required 14 points of lubrication, precise headspace adjustment, and regular cleaning to maintain its 800 to 900 rounds per minute cyclic rate. It was a magnificent weapon in temperate conditions. At -30 degrees, the recoil booster froze. The bolt carrier gummed up. The barrel change mechanism, designed for speed, became impossible to operate with numb fingers. Gunners learned to urinate on frozen mechanisms to thaw them temporarily. When that failed, the MG-34 became a 12-kilogram burden. Soviet tactics evolved around these realities. The Red Army issued PPSH-41s on a scale unimaginable to Western armies, entire battalions of submachine gunners, not just squad leaders. In close quarters forest fighting at -35 degrees, a Soviet platoon could put 3,000 rounds per minute into a German position from 50 meters. The Germans, their machine guns frozen and their bolt-action rifles sluggish, couldn't generate equivalent firepower. After-action reports from the 6th Panzer Division in January 1942 note Soviet assault groups appearing to fire continuously, whilst German return fire was sporadic and ineffective. This wasn't Soviet numerical superiority, this was engineering philosophy proving itself in frozen blood. The Soviet ski troops that appeared outside Kalinin in December 1941 weren't elite specialists. They were standard infantry who'd completed winter warfare training. Every Soviet rifle division stationed in northern regions had a ski company by 1941. The skis themselves were 2.1 meters long, made of birchwood, and wider than alpine skis to distribute weight over fresh snow. Bindings were simple cable systems that worked with Valenki boots. Soldiers trained to cover 50 kilometers in a day, carrying full combat loads of 25 kilograms. They practiced shooting from skiing positions, diagonal approaches to avoid making obvious tracks, and silent movement through forests. German forces had no equivalent capability. This wasn't an oversight, it was doctrine. German military theory emphasized roads and mechanization. Infantry marched on roads or rode in trucks. When those methods failed, the army improvised. Some units received skis in January 1942, but the troops had no training. Officers reported men injuring themselves attempting to ski with full packs or simply abandoning the skis as impractical. Meanwhile, Soviet ski battalions were infiltrating behind German lines, cutting supply routes, and vanishing into forests before Wehrmacht units, road-bound and slow, could respond. The Battle of Moscow provides the stark proof. Between 5th and 7th December 1941, Soviet ski troops penetrated 40 kilometers behind German front lines around Klin, attacking supply depots, field hospitals, and command posts. The German 3rd Panzer Group reported attacks from all directions by highly mobile enemy forces. These weren't massed assaults. These were company-sized units appearing out of snowstorms, destroying targets, and disappearing. German casualties from these raids exceeded 2,000 in 3 days, but the psychological impact was greater. Wehrmacht soldiers, who'd spent 6 months advancing, now faced an enemy who could strike anywhere, anytime, and couldn't be caught. Soviet after-action reports described the tactics with clinical precision. Ski troops would approach German positions using terrain and weather as cover, moving during snowstorms when visibility dropped to 50 meters, or at dawn when sentries were coldest and least alert. They'd close to within 100 meters, then assault using massed submachine gun fire. The engagements lasted minutes. By the time German forces organized a response, the attackers had withdrawn. Lieutenant Mikhail Belov of the 60th Ski Battalion recorded 12 such raids between the 6th and 20th of December, covering over 400 kilometers. His unit suffered 23 casualties and inflicted an estimated 300. This wasn't sustainable for German defenders, who couldn't rest, couldn't predict attacks, and couldn't pursue. Soviet tank design incorporated winter operation from the beginning. The T-34, which began reaching front-line units in summer 1941, featured several elements that seemed puzzling to German intelligence but proved crucial in winter. The diesel V2 engine, unusual for tanks at the time, most of which used petrol, was less prone to cold start failures. Diesel fuel didn't vaporize like petrol, meaning it didn't freeze in fuel lines as readily. The V2 also featured a compressed air starting system that could turn the engine even when oil had thickened to near solid consistency. Crews learned to drain oil at night, heat it over fires, and pour it back warm in the morning. With petrol engines, this was impossible. Fuel would ignite. The Christie suspension, with its large road wheels and wide tracks, distributed the T-34's 26.5 tons over a ground pressure of just 0.62 kilograms per square centimeter. German Panzer IIIs and IVs, with narrower tracks, exerted 1.0 plus kilograms per square centimeter. In snow deeper than 30 centimeters, which covered western Russia from November through March, this difference was mobility versus immobility. Soviet tanks could traverse terrain that German panzers simply couldn't enter. The Battle of Mikhailov on the 6th of December demonstrated this brutally. The 1st Guards Tank Brigade, with 48 T-34s, attacked German positions across snow-covered fields. German accounts describe Soviet tanks floating over snow whilst their own panzers sank to the hull. Anti-tank guns couldn't be repositioned because crews couldn't move them through deep snow. The result was a rout. German responses were improvised and inadequate. Panzer crews tried fitting oversized tracks, Ostketten, to improve flotation, but supplies didn't arrive until February 1942, too late for the Moscow counteroffensive. Even when they did, installation required workshop facilities that weren't available at the front. Meanwhile, engine failures plagued German armor throughout winter. The Maybach HL-120TRM engine in the Panzer III required preheating for 30 minutes before starting at -20 degrees. Crews learned to light fires under engine compartments, risking fuel tank explosions. Soviet tankers, using diesel heaters and compressed air starters, could start engines in minutes. The tactical implications reshaped the entire Moscow campaign. Whilst German panzer divisions became road-bound, their tanks could only operate on cleared routes. Soviet tank brigades retained cross-country mobility. This allowed them to exploit gaps, encircle German units, and threaten supply lines in ways German commanders thought impossible in winter. General Heinz Guderian's war diary from December 1941 repeatedly notes Soviet tanks appearing in unexpected locations and German units unable to maneuver off-roads. This wasn't Soviet tactical brilliance outthinking German expertise. This was engineering enabling tactics that German equipment simply couldn't execute. Soviet artillery doctrine in winter combat revealed another dimension of their systematic preparation. The standard Red Army field gun, the 76mm divisional gun M1942, ZS-3, incorporated features that seemed like compromises but proved essential in extreme cold. The recoil mechanism used a glycerin-based fluid that remained effective to -50 degrees, unlike the petroleum-based fluids in German guns that became viscous below -20. The split trail carriage could be manhandled by its crew even in deep snow. The trails were designed with specific dimensions to allow 6 men to lift and pivot the 1,200-kilogram gun without mechanical assistance. German artillery crews discovered their equipment's limitations through bitter experience. The 10.5-centimeter Luftwaffe-18 howitzer, the Wehrmacht's standard field piece, required its recoil fluid to be drained and heated before firing in extreme cold. The process took over an hour. Once operational, the mechanism would function for perhaps 20 rounds before cooling and seizing. Soviet batteries, by contrast, could begin firing within minutes of arriving at a position and maintain sustained fire. At the Battle of Tula in December 1941, Soviet artillery battalions fired preparation barrages exceeding 5,000 rounds in 3 hours at temperatures of -32 degrees. German counter-battery fire was sporadic and ineffective. Their guns literally couldn't match the fire rate. The ammunition itself presented challenges the Soviets had anticipated. Artillery propellant charges lose consistency in extreme cold, affecting range and accuracy. Soviet ammunition was manufactured with winter variants using different propellant formulations for temperatures below -20 degrees. Shells were marked with color codes indicating their temperature rating. Gunners were trained to adjust firing tables based on actual temperature, measured at the gun position. This level of systematic preparation, manufacturing separate winter ammunition stocks, training gunners in cold-weather ballistics, providing thermometers to every battery, represented institutional knowledge that German artillery completely lacked. German gunners improvised as best they could, but improvisation was no substitute for engineering. Attempts to warm ammunition before firing by storing it near fires led to explosions. Using summer ammunition in winter conditions meant shells consistently fell 200 to 300 meters short of aim points, a catastrophic error that left German infantry without effective fire support. Soviet infantrymen learned they could advance under German artillery fire with relative safety because the shells were landing in their rear areas. This wasn't incompetence. This was the physics of cold-weather ballistics destroying an army that hadn't prepared for it. The German logistical system, which had sustained rapid advances across France and deep into Russia, collapsed in winter not from shortage of supplies, but from inability to deliver them. The Wehrmacht depended on horse-drawn transport for divisional supply. Over 600,000 horses accompanied the invasion. These weren't hardy steppe ponies, but European draft horses bred for agricultural work. In Russian winter, without proper stabling, fodder supplies, or veterinary care, they died in catastrophic numbers. The Fourth Army alone lost over 180,000 horses between November 1941 and February 1942. Without horses, supplies couldn't move from railheads to frontline units. Divisions 30 kilometers from supply depots faced starvation because there was no transport. Soviet logistics operated on entirely different principles. The Red Army used native horse breeds, smaller, hardier animals that could survive on rough fodder and withstand extreme cold. More importantly, Soviet divisional supply emphasized human porters in winter conditions. Infantry units trained to move supplies on Nata sleds, lightweight wooden sleds, each capable of carrying 150 kilograms, pulled by 2 men on skis. A rifle company could move its own ammunition and rations without mechanical transport. This seemed primitive compared to German motorization, but in winter 1941-42, primitive methods worked, whilst sophisticated ones failed. The rail network presented another systematic advantage. Soviet railways used a 1,524 mm gauge, wider than the standard European 1,435 mm gauge. German locomotives couldn't run on Soviet tracks without conversion. The Wehrmacht's solution was to convert captured Soviet rolling stock and tracks to European gauge, a process requiring specialist crews and equipment. Meanwhile, the Soviets simply withdrew their rolling stock eastward and continued operating their unconverted rail network. By December 1941, German supply trains could reach only as far as converted track extended, often 100 to 200 kilometers behind the front. Soviet trains ran to within 30 kilometers of fighting positions, then supplies transferred to sleds and pack animals for final delivery. German soldiers at the front experienced this as a simple, brutal reality. They were freezing and starving whilst their opponents were fed, warm, and equipped. Letters captured from German troops in January 1942 describe the shock repeatedly. One Gefreiter wrote, "We were told the Russians have nothing, that they are beaten. How then do their soldiers have winter clothing whilst we freeze? How do they fire so much ammunition whilst we ration every shot?" The answer wasn't Soviet industrial superiority. German production still exceeded Soviet output in most categories. The answer was that Soviet supplies reached combat troops, whilst German supplies sat in depots 200 kilometers away, inaccessible because the horses were dead and the trucks wouldn't start. The Wehrmacht Medical Service reported 228,000 frostbite casualties between November 1941 and March 1942 on the Eastern Front. This exceeded battle casualties for the same period. Frostbite wasn't a random medical condition, it was the direct result of equipment and training failures. German boots, as mentioned, constricted circulation. But beyond footwear, German soldiers lacked systematic training in cold weather injury prevention. Awareness of early frostbite symptoms, the subtle numbness before tissue damage becomes irreversible, wasn't part of Wehrmacht training. Soldiers didn't know that rubbing frozen flesh causes tissue damage or that rapid re-warming leads to gangrene. Field hospitals became amputation centers. Soviet military medicine, by contrast, had incorporated 2 decades of cold weather experience. Every Soviet soldier received training in frostbite recognition and first aid. Units conducted daily inspections where soldiers checked each other's extremities for early signs of freezing. This wasn't medical care. This was prevention embedded in unit routine. The result was a Soviet frostbite casualty rate roughly 1/10 the German rate, despite fighting in identical conditions. This represented tens of thousands of combat-effective soldiers the Germans simply lost to preventable injuries. The strategic implications were devastating. A German infantry division that suffered 15% frostbite casualties wasn't just depleted, it was terrified. Soldiers knew that survival depended on staying near heat sources, which meant clustering in buildings and avoiding patrols. Soviet forces exploited this ruthlessly. Knowing German troops wouldn't venture into open terrain at night in extreme cold, Soviet units moved freely, set ambushes on roads they knew Germans would travel, and timed attacks for the coldest pre-dawn hours when German sentries were most impaired. This wasn't tactical genius. This was an army that understood winter warfare attacking an army that didn't. When the Red Army launched its counteroffensive around Moscow on 5 December 1941, it wasn't simply defending, it was executing a pre-planned winter campaign that weaponized cold against an unprepared enemy. The offensive involved over 1 million troops, but numbers alone don't explain its success. The timing was deliberate. Soviet meteorological services predicted the cold snap that brought temperatures to -35 degrees in early December. Operational planning specifically called for attacks during this period, knowing German forces would be maximally vulnerable. The tactics differed fundamentally from summer operations. Instead of massed frontal assaults, Soviet forces used infiltration tactics enabled by their winter mobility. Ski battalions identified gaps in German lines, which were extensive, as depleted Wehrmacht divisions couldn't maintain continuous fronts. These units penetrated deep into German rear areas, severed roads, and forced German units to withdraw from prepared positions to protect supply lines. Once German forces were moving, struggling through deep snow, exposed to wind and cold, Soviet conventional infantry attacked from multiple directions. The Battle of Kalinin provides the template. Between 5th and 16th December, the Soviet 29th and 31st Armies, reinforced by 3 ski battalions, encircled and destroyed major elements of the German 9th Army. The operation succeeded not through firepower superiority, but through mobility differential. Soviet forces moved cross-country at night, navigating by stars and terrain features, and struck German columns on roads. German units, unable to maneuver off roads and unable to see attackers in darkness and snow, suffered catastrophic casualties. The 9th Army reported losing over 20,000 men and abandoning 300 vehicles in 10 days. Captured German officers expressed disbelief that Soviet forces could operate effectively in such conditions. This pattern repeated across the entire Moscow front. At Klin, Kaluga, Tula, and Volokholamsk, Soviet forces used winter mobility to outmaneuver road-bound Germans. The result wasn't a breakthrough, it was a systematic rolling back of German forces 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow over 3 months. Wehrmacht units that had come within sight of the Kremlin in November were fighting 200 kilometers west by February. The myth of unstoppable German tactical superiority died in the snow outside Moscow, killed not by Soviet courage or numbers, but by systematic German unpreparedness for an environment the Soviets had learned to weaponize. The question that haunts the Eastern Front winter campaigns is why the Wehrmacht, renowned for tactical flexibility and combat effectiveness, failed to adapt to winter warfare even after experiencing its devastation in 1941 to 42. The answer lies in institutional culture and resource allocation. German military excellence was built on the concept of Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare emphasizing speed, shock, and exploitation. This required mechanical mobility, combined arms coordination, and rapid decision-making. Winter warfare, as the Soviets practiced it, emphasized patience, endurance, and systematic preparation, qualities that contradicted German military culture. When the Wehrmacht did attempt winter warfare training after the first winter, it remained superficial. Units rotated to Norway for cold weather courses, but these lasted weeks, not months. Equipment improved, better boots arrived, winter uniforms were manufactured, but the systematic integration of winter capability into doctrine never occurred. German tactical manuals continued to emphasize maneuver and breakthrough, concepts that required ground conditions and mechanical reliability that winter eliminated. Soviet tactical manuals, by contrast, had separate winter warfare sections detailing different techniques, different weapons employment, different logistics, different everything. This wasn't adaptation. This was a parallel military system activated when snow fell. The resource allocation reflected priorities. Germany in 1942 to 44 was fighting on multiple fronts, facing strategic bombing and struggling with fuel and raw material shortages. Manufacturing winter-specific equipment meant diverting production from tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Every diesel engine built for better cold weather starting was a petrol engine not built for a tank. Every wide-tracked winter assault gun was a standard assault gun not produced. The German High Command consistently chose immediate combat power over cold weather capability, gambling that they could win before winter or that professional soldiers would simply endure better. They lost both gambles. Soviet resource allocation was inverse. Despite being in a far more desperate strategic position in 1942 to 43, the USSR maintained winter equipment production as absolute priority. Factories evacuated from Ukraine to the Urals kept producing valenki, quilted uniforms, and skis even when tank production suffered. This represented a strategic choice. The Red Army would be a winter-capable force first, and everything else second. The payoff came in every winter campaign from 1941 through 1945. Whilst German forces dreaded the onset of cold, Soviet forces preferred winter operations because their relative advantage increased. The German-Soviet winter warfare experience reveals a principle that extends beyond equipment or tactics. Military effectiveness requires matching doctrine, training, and equipment to the actual conditions of combat, not the conditions commanders prefer. The Wehrmacht built an army optimized for short, decisive campaigns in temperate conditions. When forced to fight extended campaigns in extreme cold, their optimization became vulnerability. The Red Army, learning from the Finnish humiliation, built a force that could fight effectively across the full range of Soviet geography and climate. This required accepting compromises. Diesel engines were heavier, submachine guns were less accurate, quilted uniforms looked unmilitary. But these compromises bought capability where it mattered. Modern militaries still struggle with this lesson. Optimization for expected conflicts creates fragility against unexpected ones. The solution isn't preparing for every possibility. That's impossible. but rather building adaptability into institutions, not just into soldiers' presumed toughness. The Soviets didn't survive winter through superior endurance or ideology. They survived through systematic preparation. Equipment designed for cold, training conducted in cold, tactics developed for cold, logistics structured around cold. When winter came, they weren't adapting. They were executing their standard operational system. The Germans expected winter to help them by freezing Soviet resistance. They were right that winter would be decisive. They were catastrophically wrong about who it would favor. The Red Army didn't conquer winter. They made it their ally through 20 years of institutional learning that the Wehrmacht, in its arrogance, never imagined would matter. The frozen bodies outside Moscow in December 1941 weren't victims of weather. They were victims of institutional failure, of an army that confused tactical excellence with strategic wisdom and paid the price in blood and frost.